why capital must be understood scientifically rather than morally. Welcome to my Philosophy and Socio-Economic channel. This video may feel long, but if you stay with me until the very end, you may begin to understand why capital is not merely an economic category, but a living structure that shapes work, desire, thought, and the hidden logic of modern society. Why does wealth increase while so many people feel more trapped than ever? Why do people work harder yet feel less secure? Why does modern society produce endless goods yet persistent anxiety? We live in an era of unprecedented production, where algorithms track our every delivery and screens dictate our daily rhythms. Yet, beneath this gleaming surface of convenience, a profound sense of exhaustion permeates our lives. People enter the market with hope, believing that hard work will naturally translate into security and freedom. They internalize the competition, viewing every stumbling block as a personal failure. When the gig economy or the corporate ladder leaves them drained, they direct their resentment inward. Social contradictions are quietly transformed into personal shame, masking the structural forces that bind them to a cycle of endless labor. If we were to select the most misunderstood work of the past 200 years, capital would undoubtedly claim the highest rank. Countless individuals approach this massive intellectual architecture assuming it is simply a manifesto of moral outrage. They imagine Marx as a thinker who merely believed that capitalists do not work, or that all wealth should be evenly distributed out of pure fairness. But viewing capitalism through the lens of moral condemnation completely misses the essence of the problem. As Friedrich Engels pointed out, declaring that the distribution of wealth is unfair or immoral does not push science or understanding forward even a single inch. Righteous indignation, no matter how justified it may feel, when facing harsh social evils, cannot serve as evidence in the realm of economic science. Every epoch in human history could supply ample material for moral anger. If the solution to social misery merely required recognizing injustice, we would not need a critique of political economy. Relying on moral sentiments implies that the cure for exploitation is simply persuading the wealthy to become more compassionate, or hoping that the state will act as a benevolent guardian to distribute resources fairly. Instead, the true task of a scientific critique is to prove that these surfacing social ills are the inevitable consequence of the existing mode of production. Marx did not seek to design a perfect utopian blueprint based on idealistic virtues. His goal was to analyze the cold, iron necessity of economic laws that operate behind the backs of individuals, dictating their actions and realities. In this system, neither the worker nor the boss is completely free. Capitalists are not compelled to exploit out of inherent malice. Rather, they are pushed by the relentless need to survive in a fiercely competitive market. If one business owner chooses not to extract surplus labor while another does, the lenient owner will simply be bankrupted and swallowed by the more ruthless competitor. We frequently attribute corporate malfeasance to the personal greed of chief executive officers. When a company lays off thousands of workers while declaring record profits, the public outcry frames the decision as moral depravity. Yet, if that executive chose compassion, shareholder value would plummet. Investors would simply replace the merciful executive with someone willing to execute the brutal demands of capital accumulation relentlessly. This structural compulsion echoes deeply in our modern reality. Consider the platform algorithms that squeeze every spare second from a delivery rider. The platform does not hate the rider. It simply obeys the law of capital accumulation, which must extract value to maintain profitability. The algorithm is merely the modern embodiment of the factory machine, wearing a digital mask while performing the same ancient extraction. Fear is the invisible currency that powers this entire architecture. From the moment we enter the education system, we are taught to fear poverty and social displacement. This fear disciplines us long before we sign our first employment contract. We willingly subject ourselves to demanding bosses because the terrifying alternative of slipping into the surplus population haunts every waking hour of our modern existence. The ultimate triumph of modern capitalism is its ability to disguise compulsion as freedom. Unlike the feudal serf who was physically tied to the land, the modern worker is technically free. You can quit your job tomorrow, and no lord will hunt you down. But this freedom remains purely formal. Lacking the means to survive independently, you must voluntarily submit to the authority of another employer. We constantly hear promises that passive income or financial freedom will save us from the grind. Millions invest in stocks, real estate, or cryptocurrencies, hoping to escape the need to sell their labor. Yet this illusion hides a darker truth. Financial capital does not generate wealth out of thin air. It merely captures value extracted from the exhaustion of others operating elsewhere within the global system. People suffer profoundly under this architecture, yet they continually reproduce it every single day. When we sign an employment contract, it appears as a fair trade between free individuals. You offer your time, and the employer hands over a wage. On the surface, this exchange radiates equality and rationality, masking the subterranean reality that you are surrendering the very capacity to create value beyond what you receive. Once the workday concludes, we are thrust into the realm of consumerism, where capital attempts to soothe the wounds it just inflicted. We buy things not merely for their utility, but as desperate attempts to reclaim our shattered sense of agency. The new car or the designer clothing promises a fleeting taste of autonomy. But this very desire is manufactured by the same system that exhausted us moments ago. Consequently, we find ourselves trapped on a relentless treadmill. We work longer hours to afford commodities designed to compensate for the time we lost while working. This vicious cycle ensures that wealth continues to flow upward, even as the shelves overflow with goods. Our desires keep us tethered to the production process, functioning both as willing consumers and exhausted producers within a closed circuit of capitalist reproduction. Consider the psychological toll on the modern remote worker. The home, once a sanctuary disconnected from the rhythms of commerce, has been thoroughly invaded by the endless flow of corporate demands. Boundaries dissolve as the glowing screen transforms the bedroom into an extension of the factory floor. We sleep beside our emails, allowing the logic of accumulation to penetrate our most intimate spaces and colonize our subconscious minds completely. This colonization fosters a deeply internalized surveillance mechanism. We no longer need a physical overseer because we have absorbed the manager into our own psyche. We relentlessly monitor our own productivity, feeling intense guilt when we pause to breathe. This self-optimization culture persuades us that exhaustion is a badge of honor, hiding the fact that we are enthusiastically consuming our own vitality for someone else's profit. Against this backdrop of modern alienation, the theoretical framework provided by Marx becomes blindingly relevant. His writings cut through the fog of contemporary self-help rhetoric, while gurus counsel us to meditate harder or manage our time better, a rigorous critique of political economy, explains why time itself feels incredibly scarce. It shifts the burden from individual shortcomings to massive macroeconomic forces far beyond our immediate control. Mainstream intellectuals attempt to universalize the present, treating modern commerce as the final destination of human evolution. They strip away the bloody history of colonialism and land enclosures that paved the way for market dominance. By doing so, they transform the highly specific logic of capitalism into a natural law of the universe, persuading us that any alternative is not only impossible, but scientifically absurd. Understanding this requires a radical shift in how we perceive reality itself. We usually believe that things are exactly as they appear. We see a banknote and assume it inherently possesses value. We see a wage and assume it compensates our labor perfectly. But a true dialectical thinker treats these perceptions with deep suspicion. The given reality is merely a surface layer, hiding a boiling ocean of social contradictions. But human beings are not passive observers driven blindly by external economic forces. As we will explore throughout this series, reality is not a dead object standing outside of us. It is continuously shaped and sustained by our own sensuous, practical activity. The world exists in its current form precisely because we practically reproduce its relations every day through our obedience, our labor, and our interpersonal exchanges. Because we recreate this system through our actions, the potential for transformation always exists within human practice. We are not condemned to endure the dominance of capital forever. But breaking free requires more than sentimental outrage or empty political rhetoric. It demands a ruthless, exhaustive investigation into how the mechanism operates. We cannot dismantle a machine until we fully grasp how its gears turn and where its energy originates. To achieve this clarity, we must start at the most basic building block of the capitalist universe. We must ignore the complex financial instruments, the grand state policies, and the dazzling global markets for now. We must direct our microscopic focus toward the simplest, most mundane object that surrounds us everywhere. We must stare at the commodity until it confesses its hidden social secrets and reveals the pain contained within. Only by abandoning the comfort of moral illusions can we begin to see the invisible cages we inhabit. We must trace the historical and economic roots of our daily exhaustion, moving beyond surface frustrations to grasp the underlying machinery of social reproduction. To overcome a system, one must first dissect it with the cold, unforgiving precision of scientific inquiry. True emancipation begins not with a cry of anger, but with the quiet clarity of comprehension. Chapter 2: Commodity, Value, and the Hidden Structure of Everyday Life. Every morning we wake up and immediately interact with an endless array of objects. We turn off the alarm on a glowing screen. We pour boiling water over ground coffee beans. And we put on clothes manufactured across the globe. These objects seem completely natural to us, forming the unquestioned background of our daily routine. Yet beneath their silent and unassuming surfaces, a massive social machinery operates without our notice. When Karl Marx sat down to dissect the anatomy of modern society, he did not begin with grand theories about the state or abstract debates about human nature. He started with something so ordinary that it escapes our critical attention completely. He pointed his magnifying glass at the commodity. To understand the immense complexity of capitalism, we must truly understand the single microscopic cell that constitutes its entire working body. A commodity presents itself as a simple thing capable of satisfying a specific human need. A loaf of bread cures hunger, a heavy coat provides warmth against the winter wind, and a smartphone connects us to loved ones. This physical usefulness is what Marx calls use value. Throughout all of human history, across every culture and epoch, men and women have labored to create things with concrete use value. However, under the dominance of capitalist production, the object acquires a strange and contradictory dual identity. It is no longer just a useful thing created for direct human consumption. It becomes an exchange value, a vessel designed strictly to be traded for other items or for money. In the eyes of the market, the bread is not baked to nourish a child, but exclusively to generate revenue for the bakery. This split between usefulness and exchangeability creates a profound tension within every object we buy. When you purchase a meal delivery through an application, you care only about satisfying your craving. But the platform facilitating that meal cares absolutely nothing about your nutrition or your satisfaction. The platform views the hot meal merely as a carrier of value, a temporary physical shell masking the true goal of profit extraction. Because these two natures coexist within the same object, we witness bizarre paradoxes in the modern world. Why are mountains of perfectly edible food destroyed while millions starve? Because if the food cannot be exchanged profitably, its natural use value becomes completely irrelevant to the system. The logic of the market dictates that an item without a profitable exchange value may, as well, never have existed in reality at all. If commodities can be traded evenly, despite having entirely different physical shapes, they must share a hidden common substance. You cannot compare the comfort of a wool sweater to the speed of a laptop computer based on their physical properties. The only trait they share is that human energy was expended to create them. Beneath their diverse shells lies a pure, invisible residue of homogeneous human effort and sweat. This brings us to the core secret of the system, the dual nature of labor itself. When a carpenter builds a table or a programmer writes software, they are performing concrete labor. They use specific skills and specific tools to create a specific result. This is the creative, meaningful aspect of work that allows humans to shape their environment and express their internal capabilities through direct practical transformation. But the market radically ignores this concrete creativity. When the table or the software enters the marketplace as a commodity, the specific details of how it was made evaporate into thin air. The labor is stripped of its personality and boiled down to a single, cold metric known as abstract labor. The system does not care about the artisan's passion. It only cares about the average time spent working. This abstract labor is the true substance of value. It is measured not by individual effort, but by socially necessary labor time. If you spend 10 hours carving a chair manually, but a factory machine can produce it in 10 minutes, the market will brutally invalidate your extra hours. Your individual struggle means nothing because value is determined by the average efficiency established across the entire competitive social apparatus. We suddenly realize that we are ruled by an invisible clock. This relentless social average forces everyone to hurry, to optimize, and to squeeze more output into less time. The anxiety you feel at your desk is not merely a psychological defect. It is the direct echo of socially necessary labor time whipping you forward. The market compels constant acceleration, threatening ruin for anyone who dares to fall behind the average. Through this mechanism, social relationships between human beings are morbidly transformed into relationships between dead objects. When we walk through a supermarket, We do not see the exhausted hands of the harvester or the frustration of the factory worker. We only see price tags comparing one item to another. The brilliant facade of the commodity completely conceals the flesh and blood, sacrifices embedded deeply within its glowing synthetic surface. This phenomenon creates a deep cognitive illusion across our entire society. We begin to treat market prices as natural forces, much like gravity or the weather. We bow before financial indicators and treat them as sovereign deities dictating our destinies. We forget that value is ultimately just a social relationship between people. We invented the system, yet we now stand terrified before it, worshipping the very things our own hands created. Consider the gig economy driver racing through a rainstorm to deliver a cheap plastic toy. The consumer appreciates the quick arrival of the package. The algorithm tracks the completion in time and distributes a meager payment. The concrete suffering and anxiety of the driver disappear entirely behind the cold calculation of value. The complex web of human interdependence is reduced to a simple digital notification confirming that a transaction has concluded. Because everything must be commensurable, the system demands a universal language of value. This unavoidable necessity gives birth to money. Money steps forward as the ultimate abstract representative of human labor. It becomes the universal equivalent, a magical mirror where every commodity examines itself to measure its own worth. We chase money relentlessly, falsely believing it holds independent power, blind to the fact that it merely reflects appropriated human time. Once money takes the throne, the inner tension of the commodity explodes into the open. The split between the physical thing and its social value becomes a permanent rift, plaguing human affairs. A manufacturer might hold a warehouse full of beautiful, useful goods, but if they cannot be successfully converted into money through the final act of sale, the manufacturer faces financial devastation, regardless of the physical abundance attained. This perpetual anxiety of the unsold commodity haunts the modern economy. It drives the vicious cycles of aggressive advertising and planned obsolescence. We are bombarded with psychological manipulation designed to ensure that we never stop desiring, never stop purchasing, and never stop converting concrete goods back into abstract financial gain. Our personal insecurities are weaponized daily just to keep the fragile chain of commodity exchange functioning without a catastrophic interruption. By reducing all qualitative differences of human life into the quantitative sameness of value, we drain the world of its meaning. Our friendships, our passions, and our quiet moments are constantly threatened by the pressure to monetize them. The hobby becomes a side hustle. The conversation becomes a networking opportunity. The invisible logic of the commodity slowly bleeds into our most private thoughts, turning every human trait into a tradable asset. To understand this abstract mechanism is to take an essential step toward reclaiming our stolen sanity. We must recognize that the value dictating our lives is not a law of physics, but a specific historical construct born from practical human arrangements. We must look beyond the price tag to see the hidden human connections masked by the market. Only then can we prepare to face the true Leviathan waiting ahead. The commodity and its money form are merely the quiet prologue to a much more violent drama. When money gathers enough power to become a self-expanding force, a terrifying threshold is crossed. It transforms from a mere medium of exchange into an autonomous monster demanding endless growth. We are now standing at the very edge of the abyss, staring down into the restless, infinite engine of modern society. The things we hold in our hands secretly hold us captive. Chapter 3. Labor Power and the Secret of Surplus Value. We have seen how value manifests as commodities and money. But when money begins to seek its own expansion, a terrifying threshold is crossed. It is no longer a simple tool used to facilitate trade between human beings. It becomes capital, an independent force driven by a single, insatiable desire to accumulate more of itself. This transformation alters the fundamental rhythm of human civilization entirely. For a long time, economists struggled to explain where this extra value originated. If the market operates on the principle of equal exchange, where every trade is fair, how does a fortune grow? Buying low and selling high might enrich one merchant, but it merely transfers existing wealth, without creating a single drop of new value for society as a whole. The secret lies hidden not in the brightly lit marketplace, but behind the closed doors of the production process. To expand its value, capital must find a very specific, magical commodity on the open market. This object must possess the miraculous ability to create more value than it actually costs to maintain. This unique commodity is human labor power, the very essence of human vitality. Classical thinkers deeply confused the concept of labor with labor power. When you sign an employment contract, you do not sell your actual labor, because the work has not yet occurred. You are selling your labor power, which is your physical and mental capacity to work over a set period. The capitalist purchases your potential and rents your body and mind. Like any other commodity, labor power has a cost of production. Its value is determined by what is necessary to keep you alive, rested, and capable of returning to work the next day. Your wage merely covers this basic maintenance cost, paying for your food, shelter, and minimal recovery. It does not compensate you for the actual value you will produce. Here, the most profound magic trick of modern society occurs. You might produce enough value to cover your daily wage within the initial 4 hours of your shift. Yet your contract binds you to work for 8 hours. Those remaining 4 hours constitute surplus labor. The value created during this unpaid time is secretly siphoned away as surplus value, forming the ultimate source of all profit. Capital employs several primary methods to extract even more from our bodies. One brutal approach is absolute surplus value, achieved by simply stretching the working day. In the 19th century, this meant forcing men, women, and children to toil for 16 hours. Today, it manifests when your boss expects you to answer emails at midnight, or when a gig worker must drive 14 hours just to make rent. When physical limits prevent the day from being stretched further, capital pivots to relative surplus value by introducing better machinery, software, or algorithmic management. The system drastically increases your efficiency. You now produce your wage equivalent in just 2 hours, leaving 6 hours of value for the capitalist. We work faster than ever, yet the benefits flow exclusively upward. This brutal reality is perfectly concealed by the illusion of the wage. In feudal times, exploitation was obvious because the peasant knew exactly which days were spent working for the lord. Under capitalism, the wage creates the fictional appearance that every single minute of your work has been fairly compensated. We accept our exhaustion believing we were paid in full. The psychological devastation wrought by this arrangement is immense. We constantly feel exhausted because our very life force is being quietly drained to feed a system that never sleeps. When we struggle to pay bills, despite working relentlessly, we blame our own individual incompetence. We fail to realize that our poverty is a structural necessity designed to keep us desperate enough to keep selling our labor power continuously. Modern platform economies weaponize this relationship with terrifying precision. The application tells the delivery rider that they are an independent contractor, offering the false promise of freedom. Yet the algorithm constantly depreciates their payouts and tightens their delivery windows. The platform owns the infrastructure and dictates the terms, extracting maximum surplus value while brilliantly evading any traditional responsibility toward the worker. Ultimately, the capitalist is not necessarily an evil individual plotting our demise. They are merely the conscious bearer of the objective logic of capital. If they refuse to extract surplus value as ruthlessly as their rivals, they will be bankrupted and replaced. The tragedy of our epoch is that both the exploiter and the exploited are shackled to a blind engine that must consume human life to survive. To comprehend this mechanism is to shatter the grand myth of meritocracy that anchors our current reality. We must finally understand that immense corporate wealth is not the result of superior intellect or abstract innovation. It is simply accumulated, unpaid time. It is the stolen vitality of millions of exhausted workers, crystallized into a form that now stands above us, demanding even more obedience. The wage is not the reward for your labor, but the receipt for your surrendered time. Chapter 4: Production, Machinery, Discipline, and the Transformation of Human Life. We stand in a world astonishingly rich with technological marvels. From the steam engines of the 19th century to the artificial intelligence networks of the 21st century, humanity has continuously invented brilliant devices to conquer nature. We always imagined that these magnificent machines would eventually liberate us from drudgery. We believed technology would shorten our working hours and gift us the ultimate luxury of free time. Yet, the exact opposite phenomenon has materialized before our eyes. Despite possessing tools of unimaginable power, modern people suffer from unprecedented levels of burnout and time scarcity. Instead of delivering leisure, our advanced devices have functioned to chain us even more tightly to our tasks. To understand this tragic paradox, we must enter the physical and digital factories to observe how capital commands the machinery of production. In pre-industrial times, the artisan maintained a masterful relationship with their instruments. A carpenter or a blacksmith wielded the hammer, dictating its rhythm, direction, and force. The tool served simply as an extension of human will and organic bodily capacity. The worker commanded the tool, injecting their unique skill and personal creativity into the wood or metal residing on the workbench before them. But when capital fully reorganized production, a terrifying reversal took place. The machine no longer exists as a mere tool for the worker to guide. Instead, the human being is tragically demoted to a mere appendage of the machine. The gigantic mechanism possesses its own relentless tempo, and the living flesh must synchronize with the dead iron. The machine commands, and the human must blindly obey. This shift represents a violent psychological shock to the human constitution. The worker is stripped of all meaningful interaction with the final product. They do not craft a whole object from start to finish. They merely turn a single screw or monitor a flashing console for 10 continuous hours. The mind is forcibly emptied of all creative thought, rendering the brain redundant while the body suffers exhaustion. Through this process, capital achieves something truly chilling. It gathers the collective knowledge of humanity, our sciences and our innovations, and crystallizes them into heavy machinery. But because this machinery is privately owned as capital, it confronts the worker as a hostile, alien force. The immense productive power of society is turned into a weapon, designed to extract every ounce of sweat from the laborer. You might assume that this brutal dynamic only applied to the sooty factories of the distant past. You might believe that the transition to white-collar office work or the gig economy has freed us from such draconian physical discipline. But capital has merely refined its techniques. The roaring gears have been replaced by silent algorithms, yet the structural domination has grown exponentially more intimate and pervasive. Consider the modern office space and the phenomenon of remote work. The laptop and the smartphone operate as highly efficient digital factories. Management software tracks every keystroke, monitors eye movement, and records active screen time with terrifying precision. The white-collar worker sits in a comfortable chair, but is monitored more aggressively than any 19th century textile worker sweating on a dusty factory floor. The discipline formerly imposed by an angry foreman with a stopwatch is now enforced by a glowing dashboard. If you stop typing or look away to gather your thoughts, the system flags you for inefficiency. This relentless surveillance induces a chronic state of nervous anxiety. You begin to internalize the machine, feeling deep guilt whenever you step away to satisfy basic biological needs like drinking water or resting. We must also analyze the plight of the modern logistics worker and the delivery rider. They do not need to check into a centralized physical building to suffer exploitation. The smartphone application functions as an invisible manager, residing right in their pocket. The artificial intelligence cowcoats the most punishing routes, demanding that the worker navigate through hazardous traffic to satisfy radically compressed delivery windows. If the rider pauses for breath, the algorithm plunges their rating into the abyss, threatening them with instant dismissal. This invisible management deflects all moral responsibility away from the corporate owners. When a rider crashes because they were desperately chasing a countdown timer, the platform shrugs off the tragedy. The system treats the damaged human body as acceptable collateral damage in the infinite quest for accelerated circulation. What we witness here is the triumph of dead labor over living labor. Marx used this metaphor repeatedly to describe the core horror of industrial capitalism. Machines and algorithms represent accumulated past labor frozen in time. When they are deployed as capital, they actively consume the vital energy of the currently living worker. The system feeds upon the pulse of life to animate its own mechanical expansion. Capital has no intrinsic animosity toward the working class. It simply cares nothing for them. If it could extract profit entirely without humans, it would gladly do so. But until that moment arrives, it must treat human labor power as fuel to be burned efficiently. Workers are reduced to conscious linkages, bridging the gaps between inanimate mechanisms, forced to compensate for the current limitations of automation. This constant optimization demands complete subordination. The educational system must therefore prepare children for this eventual reality early in life. Schools operate strangely like factories, conditioning students to tolerate endless repetition, obey arbitrary authority, and move according to ringing bells. We are methodically trained to accept boredom and strict temporal discipline so that we will not rebel when we finally sign our employment contracts. The pervasive illusion maintained by our society is that technological advancement automatically elevates the human condition. Economists point to the abundance of cheap consumer electronics or calorie-dense food as proof of systemic benevolence. But this abundance merely masks the fact that the quality of our subjective experience has dramatically deteriorated. We are drowning in cheap goods, while experiencing a catastrophic drought of meaning and autonomy. When machinery increases our productive power, it should theoretically reduce the length of the working day. If a worker can now produce a car in a single hour instead of 20, why has the workweek not shrunk accordingly? Because under the rule of capital, the purpose of the machine is not to reduce toil. The exclusive purpose is to shorten the necessary labor time to extract greater relative surplus value. Instead of going home to their families early, the worker is forced to produce 20 cars in the same duration. The immense gain in efficiency is completely captured by the capitalist in the form of profit. Meanwhile, the worker remains stuck on the same treadmill, often facing the added threat of layoffs, because the new machinery requires fewer human hands to operate at maximum capacity. This threat of unemployment functions as a crucial disciplinary mechanism, a reserve army of labor consisting of the desperate and the unemployed, constantly shadows the active workforce. When a machine replaces a worker, that discarded individual falls into the reserve army. Their hunger serves as a terrifying warning to those still employed. You must work harder, accept lower wages, and endure the speed-up, or you will be replaced immediately. Consequently, fear permeates the production process completely. The worker views the new software update, or the sleek robotic arm, not as a wonder of human ingenuity, but as a direct mortal threat. The incredible achievements of science, which should be celebrated as the collective triumph of humanity, are systematically weaponized against the very people who physically assemble the future. We also see the rise of extreme alienation, because the worker does not own the product, does not control the process, and does not command the machine. They become utterly estranged from their own fundamental nature. Work, which could be a joyful expression of human potential, degrades into a loathsome burden. We only feel truly human outside of work, engaging in purely animal functions like eating, drinking, and sleeping. This psychological void is what drives the insatiable hunger for passive entertainment, after suffering complete depletion. In the digital or physical factory, we lack the energy for deep intellectual engagement or genuine social connection. We collapse in front of screens, numbing our fractured consciousness with endless scrolling. Our exhaustion fuels entire industries, designed strictly to distract us until we must return to the assembly line the next morning. Even our most intimate emotional faculties are coopted by the production process. Modern service work demands that we perform endless enthusiasm, smiling mechanically at customers while suppressing genuine frustration. This emotional labor leaves us hollowed out, making it difficult to express authentic affection for our own families. Capital reaches deep into the soul, extracting our smiles and our empathy to lubricate the machinery of commerce. When we look at the glittering towers of corporate headquarters or the massive warehouses supplying the globe, we must practice a new way of seeing. We must not merely see architectural achievements or logistical miracles. We must see the concentrated suffering, the stolen hours, and the forced subordination that made them possible. Every monument of modern capital is simultaneously a monument to human alienation. Understanding the factory and the office not as neutral spaces of commerce, but as arenas of fierce structural conflict is absolutely vital. The disciplinary architecture of production reveals that exploitation does not merely happen when paychecks are issued. Exploitation happens continuously throughout the day, It occurs in every mandated task, every monitored minute, and every forced smile extracted under the invisible threat of economic ruin. We must also examine the extreme division of labor that accompanies the rise of heavy machinery. Historically, a craftsperson understood the entire operation necessary to build an object. But to maximize speed, capital chops the production process into microscopic, repetitive fragments. A worker may spend 40 years doing nothing but attaching a single component to a moving belt, completely ignorant of the larger engineering principles at play. This intentional fragmentation ensures complete dependency. If you possess a comprehensive skill, you might harbor dangerous illusions of independence. But if your entire vocational identity is reduced to pressing 3 specific buttons in sequence, you are rendered wholly expendable and powerless outside the factory gates. The division of labor deliberately stunts the intellectual and physical development of the worker to guarantee absolute docility. The paradox deepens when we consider the physical toll of this sedentary yet frantic existence. The modern human body did not evolve to sit motionless under fluorescent lights while the central nervous system is bombarded by digital stimuli. We suffer from chronic pain, deteriorating posture, and pervasive insomnia. The production process literally deforms our physiology, reshaping our bones and nerves to better serve the imperatives of profit. We tolerate this deformation because the system brilliantly deflects blame through the ideology of self-improvement. When your back aches from the ergonomic chair, the system sells you a massage device or a yoga subscription. It individualizes structural harm, demanding that you medicate and stretch away the injuries inflicted by the workplace. You must personally pay the cost to repair your body so it can endure further extraction tomorrow. Thus, the sphere of production extends far beyond the office walls. It captures the entirety of human existence. Even our sleep becomes a necessary phase of industrial maintenance. We do not rest to dream or to reflect. We rest strictly to recharge our depleted batteries for the coming shift. Capital claims ownership over our entire biological cycle, turning the purest aspects of living into predictable inputs for a cold algorithm. Recognizing this absolute subsumption of life under capital is the only way to grasp the true magnitude of the problem. We are not merely discussing unfair wages or bad bosses. We are discussing the systematic mutilation of human potential. We are confronting an economic architecture that looks upon the tremendous brilliance of the human mind and decides that it is best utilized as a mindless extension of a metallic gear. To break this spell, we must understand that the problem is not the technology itself. The microchip and the assembly line are incredible testaments to our collective genius. The tragedy lies entirely in the social framework that commands them. If liberated from the dictates of profit, these astonishing mechanisms could indeed eradicate drudgery and usher in an era of authentic human flourishing and unprecedented freedom. The path toward that emancipation begins with unveiling the hidden battlefield where our time is stolen. It requires a fierce rejection of the idea that exhaustion is inevitable or that our subordination to dead labor is a natural law. We must look at the machine and the algorithm not as our indisputable masters, but as kidnapped instruments waiting to be reclaimed by the living workers who truly built them. The tool that was meant to elevate us has become the heavy chain that drags us down. Chapter 5. Circulation, Reproduction, Accumulation, and the Expansion of Capital. We have observed the dark interior of the factory where surplus value is quietly extracted from exhausted bodies. But the creation of value is only the first phase of a much larger, relentless cycle. If the newly produced commodities simply sit in a dusty warehouse, the capitalist gains absolutely nothing. The extracted value remains entirely theoretical until it successfully crosses the perilous bridge of the open market. Marx called this crucial transition the most dangerous leap for the commodity. The physical goods must be sold. They must shed their material bodies and transform back into pure money. If consumers do not buy them, the entire chain breaks. The sweat of the worker and the investment of the owner are both instantly rendered worthless. The system survives only if the goods continually flow. Therefore, capital exists as a restless traveler, constantly changing its physical form. It begins as money capital, used to purchase raw materials and human labor power. It then morphs into productive capital, grinding inside the factory walls to create new items. Finally, it emerges as commodity capital, waiting desperately on store shelves to be exchanged for a larger sum of money. This cycle must repeat endlessly. In our modern era, this desperate need to circulate goods drives the frantic pace of global logistics. The massive container ships, the sprawling automated warehouses, and the exhausted delivery drivers are all expressions of capital rushing to complete its cycle. A delay of a single day costs millions. The system demands frictionless movement, pushing human bodies to their absolute limits to ensure packages arrive overnight. The speed at which this cycle completes is known as the turnover of capital. A bakery that sells all its bread, by the end of the afternoon completes its turnover daily, extracting a small profit hundreds of times. A year. A heavy machinery manufacturer may take an entire year to build and sell a single turbine. The faster capital circulates, the more frequently it can capture surplus value. This explains the modern obsession with acceleration. Fast fashion brands design, manufacture, and ship garments within weeks, only for them to fall apart after 3 washes. Planned obsolescence is not a mistake. It is a structural necessity to guarantee rapid turnover. We are relentlessly bombarded by advertising because our continuous, accelerated consumption is the only thing keeping the massive wheel of circulation turning. When the capitalist finally secures the expanded sum of money, a critical decision arises. If they simply spend the profit on personal luxury, the cycle remains the same size. This is simple reproduction. But capitalism cannot tolerate stagnation. The iron law of competition dictates that the owner must reinvest the profit into better machines and more workers. This relentless reinvestment is called expanded reproduction. Through expanded reproduction, capital begins to accumulate. It rolls forward like an avalanche, growing larger and more powerful with every completed rotation. What began as a modest enterprise swells into a monopolistic empire. The wealth generated by past labor is weaponized to command even more future labor. The worker essentially builds the very fortress that will trap them more securely the following year. As capital accumulates, the landscape of society is fundamentally altered. Small businesses are crushed by massive conglomerates that benefit from economies of scale. We are told that the free market promotes diverse choices, but the reality is an undeniable concentration of power. A handful of invisible monopolies dictate what we eat, what we watch, and how we work, leaving us with merely the illusion of autonomy. This accumulation process harbors a dark and inescapable consequence. As wealth accumulates at one pole of society, in the form of massive financial empires, misery, agony, and toil accumulate at the opposite pole. The widening gap between the billionaire class and the precarious working class is not a glitch in the system. It is the absolute, mathematical result of capital operating exactly as it was designed. We feel this polarization intimately in our daily lives. Despite rising global productivity, millions live paycheck to paycheck, terrified of a single medical emergency or an unexpected car repair. We are told that if we hustle harder, we too can accumulate wealth. But the structural reality ensures that the vast majority can only ever sell their labor power, forever running on a treadmill that powers someone else's ascent. The system masks this violent reality through the complex sphere of distribution. We see landlords collecting rent, banks collecting interest, and shareholders collecting dividends. It appears as though land, money, and stock shares magically generate wealth on their own. But these are merely different factions of the capitalist class slicing up the same pie of surplus value, originally extracted from the exhausted worker on the factory floor. Today, this illusion reaches its peak in the financialized economy. We are encouraged to borrow against our futures, using credit cards and mortgages to sustain our basic survival. The banks extract interest directly from our future wages, effectively colonizing our tomorrows. Capital no longer waits for us at the workplace. It meets us in our homes, demanding a cut of our existence just to allow us a place to sleep. The engine of circulation and accumulation hums with terrifying efficiency. But this blind, insatiable hunger for expansion contains the seeds of its own destruction. By constantly suppressing the wages of the very people expected to buy the overflowing goods, capital paints itself into a dangerous corner. The massive snowball of wealth grows, increasingly unstable, as it rolls closer toward the edge of an inevitable cliff. The wealth we marvel at is merely the shadow of our own stolen time. Chapter 6: Crisis, Contradiction, and Why Capital Cannot Rest. We often believe that an economic crisis occurs when society lacks essential resources. We imagine famines or natural disasters where absolute scarcity threatens human survival. But modern capitalism introduces a terrifying and completely unprecedented phenomenon to history. It experiences catastrophic crises, not because there is too little wealth, but shockingly, because there is far too much. During these violent market crashes, an absurd epidemic of overproduction sweeps across the globe ruthlessly. Society suddenly reverts to a bizarre state of barbarism, as if a destructive war has swallowed all life. We witness the grotesque spectacle of mountains of perfectly usable goods being destroyed while millions of people hunger and shiver in the cold. This absurdity arises from the ultimate internal contradiction plaguing the entire system. Capital operates with a blind, insatiable drive to expand production infinitely without any rational limits. Yet simultaneously, it ruthlessly suppresses the wages and the relative consumption capacity of the working masses. The exhausted workers simply cannot afford to buy back the colossal output they created. Consider the devastating global financial crash of 2008 as a perfect historical example of this fatal flaw. The crisis ignited because the real estate industry constructed vast quantities of houses that ordinary people simply could not afford. When the commodities could not be sold, the vital chain of circulation snapped, plunging global society into chaos. Behind this violent rupture lies a slower, more fatal disease plaguing the system. Marx identified the tendency of the rate of profit to fall as the most essential and important law of modern political economy. To survive vicious competition, capitalists must constantly upgrade their technology, investing heavily in advanced machinery and complex, algorithmic software. As the ratio of dead machinery increases against the proportion of living human workers, a fatal paradox unfolds inside the factory. Because surplus value is extracted exclusively from living labor, squeezing humans out of the workplace inadvertently shrinks the true pool of available profit. In its frantic race for efficiency, capital slowly strangles the only golden goose remaining. To delay this inevitable structural decline, the system deploys desperate countermeasures. It unleashes the unregulated power of financial capital, encouraging young people and desperate families to rely heavily on online loans and credit cards. By pushing the working class into deep debt, capital artificially inflates consumption to keep the giant factories humming at maximum speed. This aggressive financialization transforms the entire economy into a dangerous illusion and a house of cards. Financial capital essentially secures profits by extracting surplus value from the distant future before the worker has even performed the labor. We mortgage our tomorrows just to survive today, guaranteeing an implosion when reality fails to meet speculative bets. When the financial illusion finally shatters, capital ensures that it does not bear the heaviest agony itself. The system quickly transfers the massive economic losses directly onto the fragile shoulders of the ordinary workers. Through sudden layoffs, brutal salary cuts, and harsher working conditions, the elite class forces the precarious multitudes to pay the ultimate price. We are left with a chilling and unavoidable realization regarding our modern existence. The capitalist framework has conjured immense productive forces, but it now resembles a sorcerer who can no longer control the terrifying demonic spells he cast. The invisible hand does not guide us toward equilibrium. It relentlessly pushes society toward periodic chaos and deepening inequality. The crisis is not a glitch in the machine, but the beating heart of its design. Chapter 7. Practice, Matter, Consciousness, and Marx's Philosophical Revolution. When we hear the word materialism, we often imagine a cold, dead universe constructed entirely of lifeless atoms and empty space. We are taught to believe that matter exists completely independent of us, operating like a giant clockwork mechanism, while human consciousness merely watches passively from the outside. This mechanical view strips us of our agency, reducing humanity to a helpless passenger on the train of destiny. For generations, rigid textbooks have presented a deeply flawed dualism, separating the world into strict categories of matter and mind. They preach that objective conditions determine everything, fostering a tragic sense of fatalism among those who suffer under modern exploitation. If the economy is an unstoppable natural force, the exhausted worker concludes that resistance is useless, choosing instead to passively accept their grinding reality. But Marx completely shattered this paralyzing illusion by introducing a revolutionary concept that bridges the gap between the subject and the object. He argued that we never actually encounter abstract matter in our daily lives. We only interact with concrete, specific things like a stone, a tree, or an apple. The idea of pure matter is merely an abstraction created in the human mind. The true bridge connecting our minds to the physical universe is human practice, which is our sensuous, active engagement with the world. Consider what happens when you kick a heavy stone resting on the ground. In that exact fraction of a second, the objective hardness of the rock and your subjective experience of pain are established simultaneously through the concrete act of kicking. Before that physical interaction occurs, discussing the ultimate essence of the stone, or the isolated nature of consciousness, remains an empty philosophical fantasy. Knowledge is never a passive reflection sucked into the brain from a distance. When we encounter a strange new fruit, we must bite into it to discover its taste, actively updating our mental understanding through direct, sensuous bodily experience. This profound insight radically transforms how we must understand human history and social change. Society does not evolve because of some mystical, independent destiny, or because abstract economic laws propel us forward automatically. History is nothing but the accumulated result of continuous human practice, driven exclusively by the sweat, ingenuity, and desperate struggles of ordinary working masses over countless generations. When we recognize that capital is not a law of physics, but a specific social relationship woven through daily human action, the horizon openly shifts. The system relies on our continuous practical obedience to survive. It demands that we wake up, clock in, and accept the commodification of our vital energy. Every single morning, perpetuating the illusion that capital holds supreme reign. Philosophy must therefore cease being an academic exercise confined to ivory towers, debating invisible realities that have no bearing on human suffering. Its ultimate purpose must be to serve human emancipation, grounding itself in the visceral reality of the exhausted worker and the anxious citizen. Theory becomes a weapon only when it speaks directly to the flesh and blood reality of practical life. By bringing philosophy down from the heavens and placing it firmly onto the factory floor and the pavement, Marx revealed our true power. We are not the hopeless captives of abstract economic categories, nor are we doomed to worship the wealth we created. Because we practically reproduce the chains that bind us, we inherently possess the practical capacity to break them. The world is not a prison we were placed inside, but a canvas we have forgotten we are painting. Chapter 8: History, Society, and the Social Logic of Reproduction. When we look upon the vast architecture of human civilization, we often assume that society is a permanent fixture of the natural world. We believe that nations, laws, and markets exist with the same unshakable solidity as mountains and oceans. But a society is inherently fragile, requiring constant, desperate effort simply to maintain its cohesion. It must be actively and continuously reproduced through both material production and shared beliefs. To understand this monumental task, we must examine how a loose collection of desperate individuals transforms into a functioning organization. Consider the historical example of wandering refugees and starving peasants gathering in the wilderness during the final years of the Western Han dynasty. These exhausted outcasts did not originally share a grand political vision. They merely sought basic biological survival amidst a terrifying landscape of total chaos. Yet, pure chaos contradicts human nature because a truly lawless environment offers no security or predictable future. Within this desperate multitude, certain individuals stepped forward to resolve disputes, establish order, and distribute scarce resources. The refugees willingly surrendered a portion of their individual autonomy to these leaders in exchange for collective safety. Thus, the raw material of human desperation crystallized into a formidable and structured insurgent army. However, as an organization expands from a local group into a massive social machinery, brute force and charisma are no longer sufficient. Governing a vast population through constant physical coercion is an impossible and exorbitantly expensive strategy. For a grand society to survive the frictions of internal inequality, it absolutely requires a unifying set of values, a shared ideological framework that invisibly directs individual behavior and justifies the prevailing order. This is why the peasant leaders of the past could not simply crown themselves kings without inviting immediate rebellion and collapse. They desperately needed a symbol of legitimate authority to bind the fractured masses together, often elevating a forgotten royal descendant to the throne. By wrapping their power in the sacred mantle of tradition and heavenly mandate, they secured the willing obedience of the populace and stabilized the volatile realm. Throughout history, different civilizations engineered unique ideological anchors to lower the enormous costs of social governance. Ancient empires deployed elaborate religious doctrines or philosophical systems, like Confucianism, to convince the starving peasantry that the strict social hierarchy was a natural, unalterable reflection of the cosmic order. When the oppressed believe that their suffering is divinely ordained, the rulers can sleep peacefully without the constant dread of armed insurrection. In our modern capitalist epoch, the dominant ideology operates with astonishing sophistication, shedding the heavy mysticism of the past. Instead of preaching about the will of the heavens, the system worships the sanctity of the free market, the glory of individual meritocracy, and the absolute right of private property. We are taught from infancy that financial success exclusively reflects personal virtue, while poverty remains a shameful symptom of individual laziness and incompetence. This modern ideological architecture functions brilliantly to absorb and neutralize the inevitable shocks generated by economic inequality. When a giant corporation lays off thousands of exhausted employees to protect its profit margins, the discarded workers seldom march upon the corporate headquarters in violent protest. Instead, they internalize the catastrophe as a personal defeat, updating their resumes, while quietly absorbing the agony of systemic failure into their own fragile psychological structures. But ideology alone cannot feed a hungry population. The spiritual compass must be anchored to a functioning engine of material production. Any society must continuously cultivate crops, manufacture essential goods, and construct shelter to guarantee basic human survival. The fundamental task of political economy is to observe how a society bakes the immense cake of material wealth, and crucially, how it decides to slice and distribute that cake. Under the socialized production of modernity, millions of people cooperate across sprawling global networks to manufacture even the simplest commodity. Yet, while the labor process is intensely collective, the wealth generated by this massive coordination is appropriated privately. The gross domestic product relentlessly expands, but the distribution heavily favors the owners of capital over the exhausted multitudes who expend their vital energy on the screaming factory floors. This inherent contradiction between collective production and private appropriation creates a permanent seismic tremor beneath the foundations of modern society. The working masses continually generate astronomical abundance, yet they remain chronically insecure, tethered to fleeting wages that barely cover the escalating costs of rent and sustenance. When the disparity reaches critical thresholds, the invisible fabric of social trust begins to fray, threatening the delicate legitimacy of the entire governing apparatus. To prevent spontaneous collapse, the system must constantly invent new mechanisms to alleviate the explosive pressures, building within the lower strata. It offers cheap entertainment, expanded access to consumer debt, and fleeting digital distractions to sedate the restless population. The ruling logic prefers to mortgage the future and inflate vast financial bubbles rather than fundamentally alter the unjust distribution of power and wealth. That defines the underlying class hierarchy. Therefore, the social logic of reproduction is not merely about ensuring factories continue pumping out gleaming new commodities. It is ultimately about reproducing the compliant human subjects who will willingly staff those factories tomorrow morning. Capital does not only manufacture objects. It molds our desires, channels our frustrations, and shapes our very understanding of reality, ensuring we cannot imagine a better world existing beyond its invisible iron boundaries. The invisible chains of the mind are always stronger than the heavy iron on the wrists. Chapter 9. Why Marx Still Matters in the Age of Platforms, Debt, and Algorithms. We often hear the confident declaration that the world has completely transformed since the 19th century. Critics argue that because we wield smartphones instead of shovels, and because we operate in air-conditioned offices rather than sooty coal mines, the old theoretical frameworks must be entirely discarded. They insist that a digital economy operating in the cloud has finally rendered the critique of capital irrelevant and obsolete. But this triumphant narrative deliberately confuses the sparkling surface of technology with the hidden structural reality of power. While the physical appearance of labor has undoubtedly changed, the fundamental social relationship dictating how we survive remains exactly the same. The extraction of surplus value has not disappeared. It has merely relocated from the noisy factory floor into the silent, invisible architecture of our digital applications and financial networks. Consider the gig economy, which initially promised us unprecedented autonomy. The marketing campaigns persuaded millions that they could finally become their own bosses, dictating their own schedules and escaping the tyranny of corporate management. Yet the delivery rider racing through the rain quickly discovers that the human manager has simply been replaced by a cold algorithm, a dictator that cannot be reasoned with and never sleeps. This algorithmic overseer is far more ruthless than any 19th century foreman. It tracks every second, calculates the most punishing routes, and punishes any pause with instant financial penalties or deactivation. The worker enjoys the formal freedom to log off, but the constant threat of hunger forces them to willingly subordinate themselves to a digital panopticon. Freedom is reduced to choosing which application will exploit your exhaustion today. The brilliance of this modern architecture lies in how it isolates the individual. In a traditional factory, workers suffered together, creating the psychological foundation for collective solidarity. Today, the platform worker operates in complete isolation, interacting only with a screen. When the algorithm drops their pay rate, they do not see a systemic policy shift. They feel a deep, personal shame, internalizing the structural squeeze as individual incompetence. When exhausted workers can no longer survive on algorithmic wages, the system generously offers them credit. The financialization of everyday life has transformed debt into the primary instrument of social discipline. We are encouraged to borrow for our education, our healthcare, and our basic housing. We surrender decades of our future labor before we have even begun to work, shackling ourselves voluntarily through the magic of compound interest. Through mortgages and student loans, capital achieves something terrifying. It reaches forward through time to colonize our unlived tomorrows. You do not protest unfair working conditions because you are paralyzed by the fear of defaulting on your monthly payments. The bank replaces the factory owner as the ultimate sovereign, ensuring that your political passivity is guaranteed by your desperate need to maintain your fragile credit score continuously. Even our leisure time has been thoroughly captured and subsumed by capital. Social media platforms masquerade as public squares for human connection. In reality, they are massive factories where our attention, our passions, and our personal data are harvested as raw material. Every time we scroll, like, or comment, we are performing unpaid digital labor, generating immense advertising wealth for the very tech monopolies that monetize our loneliness. This relentless commodification of every aspect of existence produces a pervasive sickness of the soul. We are more connected than ever, yet we suffer through epidemics of depression and profound isolation. We feel an endless anxiety because we instinctively recognize that we are being consumed by a machinery we cannot control. The system demands constant optimization, treating the human mind not as a sanctuary, but as a processing unit. To understand why we feel so trapped despite our tremendous technological wealth, we must return to the root. We cannot rely on vague moral indignation about greedy chief executives or unfair algorithms. We must deploy the scientific framework that exposes how platforms, debt, and data are merely the latest iterations of capital attempting to expand its value by consuming human vitality. The vocabulary has evolved, but the syntax remains identical. Only by recognizing the continuity of this invisible engine can we begin to dismantle its power over our lives. The digital age did not erase exploitation. It merely perfected its disguise. We must strip away the glowing aesthetic of modern convenience to confront the ancient, hungry logic operating quietly beneath the screen. Once the illusion shatters, the possibility of a genuinely different reality finally comes into view. The glowing screen is merely the newest shadow cast by the oldest chain. Chapter 10: Freedom, Emancipation, and the Open Question of Human Possibility. We stand at the end of this vast theoretical journey. We have dissected the hidden mechanisms of the commodity, traced the silent extraction of surplus value, and witnessed the relentless accumulation of capital. Yet, the most profound question remains entirely unanswered. What does it actually mean to be a free human being in the modern epoch? We are told daily that we have reached the absolute summit of historical evolution. Modern society equates freedom with the infinite expansion of consumer choice. You are free to select among hundreds of streaming services, dozens of smartphone models, and countless brands of fast fashion. But this dazzling array of options completely masks a profound and terrifying structural powerlessness. We are granted absolute sovereignty over trivial purchasing decisions, yet we remain entirely stripped of any meaningful control over the fundamental conditions of our own existence. True freedom cannot exist when the basic requirements of life are held hostage by the market. As long as you must surrender the best hours of your waking life to an algorithmic manager or a corporate bureaucracy just to secure food and shelter, you remain intimately bound to the realm of necessity. The modern worker is legally free, yet practically tethered to an invisible treadmill that dictates their entire physical reality. How do we escape this invisible architecture? Marx refused to write specific recipes for the cookshops of the future. He intensely despised utopian thinkers who drew up perfect, flawless blueprints for a magical society. He understood that imposing a rigid, abstract ideal onto messy human reality always leads to authoritarian disaster. Emancipation is not a static destination to be reached. It is a continuous practical historical movement that actively abolishes exploitation. The immense technological apparatus we have built does not need to be destroyed. The global logistics networks, the artificial intelligence models, and the automated factories represent the crystallized genius of the human species. The revolutionary task is not to smash the machines and return to a primitive agrarian past. The task is to consciously reclaim this tremendous productive power, ripping it away from the blind dictates of private profit completely. Imagine a reality where the spectacular efficiency of automation actually serves the living worker. If an algorithm can double production speed, the immediate result should not be mass layoffs and increased dividend payments for wealthy shareholders. The result should be the drastic reduction of the mandated working day. The true measure of societal wealth is not the accumulation of commodities, but the expansion of disposable free time for every individual. Marx argued that the true realm of freedom only begins where labor determined by physical necessity ends. When humans are no longer consumed by the desperate, exhausting struggle for basic survival, an entirely new horizon of human capability will suddenly open. In this reclaimed time, the individual can finally develop their suppressed artistic, scientific, and social potentials. Work transforms from a degrading compulsion into a joyful expression of human creativity. This transition requires a profound psychological revolution alongside the economic one. We must methodically unlearn the deep capitalist conditioning that measures our human worth exclusively by our economic productivity. We must stop viewing our peers as ruthless competitors in a desperate zero-sum game for scarce resources. Solidarity must replace atomization, allowing us to recognize that personal emancipation is structurally impossible without the simultaneous emancipation of the entire human community. Mainstream economists and political commentators desperately want us to believe that history has definitively ended. They insist that the current arrangement of capital, wage labor, and debt is the final, unalterable destiny of mankind. They mock the very idea of systemic transformation as naive romanticism. But this arrogant certainty is completely blind to the violent, shifting, and deeply unstable reality of the current global system that trembles beneath our feet. The contradictions are accelerating rapidly. The ecological devastation caused by infinite growth on a finite planet, the extreme polarization of immense wealth and grinding poverty, and the rising tide of mass psychological exhaustion cannot be sustained indefinitely. Capital is fundamentally incapable of resolving the terrifying crises it continually generates. The machine is shuddering, and the future remains radically unwritten, waiting exclusively for the conscious intervention of organized human practice. We began this journey by looking at a simple commodity, and we end it by looking at ourselves. The heavy chains that bind us are forged from our own stolen time. But because they are made by human hands, they can be broken by human hands. Theory provides the necessary illumination, but only collective, practical action can turn the wheel of history. The question is whether we possess the courage to change it. The ultimate triumph of human history lies sleeping within the hours we have yet to reclaim. Chapter 11. The Intellectual Armor, Surviving the Modern Labyrinth with Dialectical Clarity. We have traversed the grand architecture of political economy, mapping the invisible forces that govern our world. Yet, when the screen fades to black and this narration concludes, a stark and unavoidable practical dilemma remains. Tomorrow morning, the alarm clock will still ring with brutal punctuality. You must still navigate the crowded commute, clock into the digital factory, and willingly surrender your labor power merely to survive. Understanding the intricate mechanics of capital does not magically alter your immediate physical reality. The rent still demands to be paid. The debts continue to accumulate interest. And the algorithmic overseer remains relentlessly unforgiving. Confronted with this unchanged material landscape, the initial reaction to grasping the totality of the system is often a profound, paralyzing wave of existential despair. When you first realize the immense scale of the machinery, you may feel utterly insignificant, like a fragile grain of sand caught within relentless iron gears. The temptation of nihilism becomes immensely powerful. If the system is so vast, so historical, and so deeply entrenched in every facet of human life, why should anyone bother struggling against it in their mundane daily existence? But yielding to despair is a fundamental misinterpretation of the theory itself. The true function of this knowledge is not to crush your spirit under the weight of historical necessity. Instead, it is designed to provide an indestructible intellectual armor against the relentless psychological warfare waged by modern society. It is the essential tool for reclaiming your sanity in an insane world. Consider the daily violence imposed by the modern workplace. Before acquiring this structural clarity, every reprimand from a manager, every missed promotion, and every algorithmic penalty was internalized as a deep personal flaw. You carried the relentless demands for corporate efficiency as a heavy burden of individual inadequacy, believing you simply were not working hard enough or optimizing your time effectively enough. Now, armed with dialectical vision, you can safely separate your inherent human worth from your temporary market value. When the manager demands faster output, you no longer interpret it as a moral failing on your part. You recognize it merely as the predictable friction of capital attempting to squeeze more relative surplus value from your exhausted nervous system to satisfy distant shareholders. This profound separation offers an immediate, tangible form of psychological liberation. You are forced to participate in the rhythms of the market, but you no longer surrender your soul to its cruel logic. You become a conscious, detached observer wandering within the factory rather than a blind, obedient cog wholly absorbed by its function. You comply materially, but you rebel intellectually. Consequently, the toxic illusion of the meritocracy finally loses its suffocating grip on your consciousness. When you encounter a billionaire flaunting astronomical wealth, you no longer feel a sense of inferiority or awe. You look through the glittering facade and clearly see the massive accumulation of unpaid labor, the stolen hours of millions of anonymous workers crystallized into private luxury. Similarly, when you see the destitute, the evicted, and the marginalized roaming the streets, you no longer view them through the lens of moral condemnation. You do not see lazy individuals who failed to grasp market opportunities. You recognize them as the tragic, structurally necessary byproduct of the system, the reserve army of labor functioning exactly as intended to suppress general wages. This radical shift resets your emotional baseline from chronic anxiety to a quiet, unshakable clarity. The modern wellness industry continually sells you meditations, applications, and yoga retreats designed strictly to make you a more resilient, compliant employee. But true philosophical clarity teaches you to stop meditating away the pain of exploitation and to start preserving your vital energy for authentic human pursuits. We must radically redefine what it means to achieve success in the 21st century. Success can no longer be measured by how high you climb the corporate ladder or how much passive income you manage to extract from others. True success becomes the quiet, defiant act of maintaining your empathy, your critical thought, and your fundamental humanity while navigating a maze designed to strip you of all three. Armed with this understanding, you can begin to cultivate microscopic zones of solidarity within your immediate environment. Whether in the fluorescent office, the isolated corridors of the gig economy, or your local neighborhood, you look at your peers differently. You no longer see ruthless competitors battling for crumbs. You see fellow captives, sharing the same invisible condition, waiting for a collective awakening. The process of historical transformation is glacially slow, characterized by long periods of grinding endurance, punctuated by sudden, unpredictable ruptures. We currently navigate the twilight years of late capitalism, a system trembling under the weight of its own absurd contradictions. Our immediate task is not to force an artificial utopia tomorrow, but to keep the intellectual flame alive through the long night. We must actively refuse the mandatory amnesia demanded by endless consumerism. We must remember our history, dissect our present, and pass this crucial structural understanding forward to the next generation. You are no longer just a passive consumer or a disposable human resource source. You are a conscious historical subject who has finally turned on the lights in a darkened room. The machine will continue to hum for now, but its hypnotic spell over your mind has been permanently broken. The truth does not immediately free the body, but it instantly unlocks the mind. Chapter 12. Beyond the Pages, the Living Task of Our Generation. We have reached the end of our expansive journey through the hidden architecture of modern society. We have traced the invisible bloodlines of value, traveling from the simplest everyday commodity to the massive, intricate algorithms that now dictate global commerce. You now possess the conceptual map required to navigate the bewildering maze of capital. But as the screen slowly fades to black, you must confront a profound and unavoidable question. What will you do with this newly acquired sight? Will you simply return to the grinding machinery tomorrow, bearing the heavy weight of this knowledge in silent, paralyzed isolation? Or will you allow this clarity to fundamentally alter your trajectory? The greatest victory achieved by the current ruling epoch is not its technological brilliance or its immense wealth. Its ultimate triumph lies in its astonishing ability to persuade us that no alternative can possibly exist. It deliberately traps our imagination within the rigid confines of the market, making any thought of emancipation seem utterly absurd. We have been thoroughly conditioned to believe that the end of capitalism is somehow more terrifying than the end of the natural world itself. We passively accept ecological devastation, crushing generational debt, and profound psychological exhaustion as if they were merely the tragic but unavoidable weather patterns of modern human existence. But history is absolutely not a closed circle, and humanity is far from a finished project. The cascading crises we face today are not natural disasters beyond our control. They are the desperate, violent tremors of a social arrangement that has entirely outlived its historical usefulness and now desperately consumes its own crumbling foundations. You must continually remember that every powerful institution, every unwritten rule of the market, and every glowing screen demanding your obedience was constructed by human hands. Because they are the direct products of human practice, they remain permanently vulnerable to conscious human transformation. The iron laws of economics only reign as long as we obey. To break this persistent spell, we must first reclaim our stolen language. We must aggressively stop referring to systemic exploitation and algorithmic cruelty as personal failures. We must stop accepting the mutilation of our vital time as the reasonable cost of doing business. We must look at the hoarded wealth and recognize our own reflection. The path forward will never be found in a single, magical rupture or a flawless, utopian blueprint delivered from above. It will be carved through the slow, agonizing, and beautiful process of rebuilding genuine human solidarity. It must begin in the fluorescent break room, on the exhausting delivery route, and within the quiet, overworked neighborhoods. Marx did not leave us a mystical crystal ball predicting the exact shape of the distant future. Instead, he left us a ruthless magnifying glass and a clear mirror. He exposed how the engine of capital extracts our vitality, and in doing so, he revealed the immense, untapped power of the ordinary working masses. We are currently standing on the uneasy precipice of a monumental historical transition. The old world is slowly dying, clinging desperately to power through financial illusions, while the new world struggles violently to be born. In this deepening twilight, our greatest responsibility is to remain radically awake and prepare for the coming dawn together. The final page of Capital is not the definitive end of the story. It is merely the necessary prologue to the real historical drama. The true conclusion cannot be written in a book or spoken through a screen. It must be lived, fought for, and practically constructed by the billions of hands holding the tools. The theory is finally yours, but the future remains ours to make. Chapter 13. The Illusion of the Middle Class and the Architecture of Modern Anxiety. For decades, the greatest ideological triumph of the global system was the invention of a comforting category known as the middle class. We were persuaded that society was no longer a brutal pyramid of exploiter and exploited, but rather a swelling diamond of prosperity. This glittering promise suggested that, with enough education and obedience, anyone could escape the precarious margins and secure a permanent position within the comfortable center. This narrative served as the ultimate buffer absorbing the shockwaves of social conflict. When the exhausted laborer looked upward, they did not see a formidable enemy hoarding wealth. They saw a feasible future for their children. The suburbs, the two-car garage, and the annual vacation became the physical proof that capital could benevolently provide for the masses. It created a powerful psychological incentive to defend the status quo fiercely. But we must examine this historical anomaly with dialectical precision. The brief era of broad prosperity in the mid-20th century was not a benevolent gift from the market, nor was it a permanent structural shift. It was a temporary concession, forced by the terrifying threat of global revolution and fueled by the plunder of distant geographies. Once that threat receded, the invisible hand quietly began to reclaim its lost territory. Today, the illusion is collapsing rapidly under the weight of its own contradictions. The traditional markers of security, such as home ownership, affordable health care, and guaranteed pensions, have been ruthlessly financialized and placed out of reach. The professional worker now finds themselves running desperately on an accelerating treadmill, working twice as hard merely to maintain the standard of living their parents achieved with absolute ease just a few decades ago. To mask this structural decline, capital deployed the weapon of cheap credit. When wages stagnated, the banks stepped forward with credit cards, mortgages, and student loans, allowing the illusion of prosperity to continue uninterrupted. But this borrowed abundance transformed the so-called middle class from a zone of security into a highly pressurized chamber of debt. We traded our future autonomy to maintain the superficial aesthetics of a vanishing present. The psychological toll of this precarious existence is profoundly devastating. Unlike the industrial worker who viscerally understood their exploitation, the modern professional carries a unique burden of shame. Because the ideology of the middle class frames success entirely as a matter of individual merit, any financial stumbling block is internalized as a deep personal failure. The anxiety of slipping down the social ladder haunts every office interaction and every sleepless night. We have become a society of high-functioning survivors, wearing professional masks while quietly drowning in insecurity. The corporate manager, the adjunct professor, and the tech developer may wield laptops instead of hammers, but their fundamental relationship to capital remains unchanged. If they stop selling their labor power for even a single month, the thin veneer of their prosperity will evaporate, revealing the cold abyss of the working class reality beneath. Recognizing this shared vulnerability is the crucial step toward genuine solidarity. The elite strategy has always relied on dividing the exhausted multitudes, convincing the professional with a university degree that they have nothing in common with the delivery rider in the rain. But once the debt burden strips away the professional arrogance, we see that both are merely different ranks within the same vast reserve army of expendable laborers. Capital is currently consuming its own buffer zone. By squeezing the professionals into precarious insecurity, it removes the very ideological cushion that prevented systemic rupture. The promise that hard work leads to security has been exposed as a cruel mathematical impossibility for the vast majority. As the squeeze tightens, the polite submission of the professional classes is slowly transforming into a quiet, smoldering resentment against the entire architecture of power. We must relinquish the nostalgic desire to rebuild the lost suburbs of the past. The goal is not to restore a temporary middle class that relied on the invisible suffering of others across the globe. The task is to confront the root mechanism that makes security so terrifyingly scarce in an age of unprecedented abundance. We must stop clinging to the edges of a sinking ship and begin constructing an entirely new vessel. The privilege we desperately guard is only the echo of a promise that was broken long ago. Chapter 14: The Commodification of Identity and the Final Frontier of Capital. We have witnessed how capital devoured the land, conquered the factory, and transformed physical human time into cold profit. Yet the expansion of capital possesses an infinite, insatiable hunger. When the productive forces of the material world reach their zenith, and all physical spaces have been commercialized, this massive machine inevitably seeks new colonies. Today, this final frontier is no longer the external natural world, but our most intimate, internal spiritual world. In past eras, the moment a worker left the factory gates, they could at least briefly revert to a relatively complete human being. Family, friendship, and quiet personal reflection once served as sanctuaries that capital could not easily touch. But modern society has exquisitely destroyed this boundary. Through omnipresent digital devices and social networks, capital has successfully dragged our entire life cycle, including our private emotions and interpersonal relationships, into an endless production process. Observe the modern obsession with cultivating a personal brand. We are taught to manage ourselves exactly like a corporation. Your character traits, your sense of humor, your physical appearance, and even your traumas and vulnerabilities are ruthlessly transformed into digital assets traded on the open market. We are no longer merely workers selling labor power. We have tragically forged our very selves into commodities displayed within glowing screens. This commodification of identity brings unprecedented psychological alienation. When you carefully engineer every smile to secure algorithmic recommendations and virtual approval, you are actually experiencing profound self-exploitation. You serve simultaneously as the cold overseer and the exhausted laborer. We willingly slice the most authentic moments of our lives into markable fragments, merely to maintain a fleeting sense of illusory existence within an infinite stream of digital information. Social media platforms are absolutely not the democratic public squares they claim to be. They are the largest and most efficient invisible factories in human history. With every swipe of the screen, every click of a button, and every comment published, you are performing unpaid digital labor. The platform does not need to pay you a single wage, yet it transforms your attention, your desires, and your relationships into highly profitable data sold directly to pervasive advertisers. During this process, authentic individuality is completely erased, replaced by highly standardized aesthetics and algorithmic disciplined expression. We mistakenly believe we are highlighting our unique essence by purchasing specific clothing or photographing specific meals. But in reality, these very desires are mass-produced by the exact same system. So-called personalization is merely a vast, complex trap designed to accelerate the circulation of commodities across diverse populations. This explains why modern individuals are constantly haunted by an indescribable emptiness. When your entire self is transformed into data that can be quantified, evaluated, and traded, your intrinsic value is utterly drained. We live in a state of chronic anxiety, fearing not only the loss of employment, but the terrifying loss of social relevance. This anxiety is not a personal psychological defect. It is the structural despair imposed by a society that views you strictly as a node of consumption. The commodity fetishism that Marx critiqued over a century ago has reached its most terrifying climax. We do not merely worship the dead objects created by our own hands. We have begun to reshape our own souls using the cold logic of those very objects. Human subjectivity dissolves within the frigid exchange of metrics, reducing us to microscopic, replaceable gears operating upon the infinite accumulation chain of capital. To shatter this suffocating digital panopticon, we must undergo an immensely difficult awakening of consciousness. We must bravely reject the pathological urge to monetize every single second of our existence. We must recognize that the true dignity of a human being resides precisely in possessing pure characteristics that absolutely cannot be priced, cannot be traded, and cannot be sold on any market. The first step toward authentic freedom is reclaiming our right to refuse to be marketed. Chapter 15: The Metabolic Rift, Ecological Rupture, and the Fiction of Infinite Growth. Throughout our exploration of this vast economic architecture, we have focused intensely on the human element. We have examined the exhausted worker, the anxious professional, and the terrifying commodification of the human soul. But there is another silent, bleeding victim, caught within the relentless gears of endless accumulation. We must finally turn our attention to the natural world, the very physical foundation that sustains every breath we take. For most of human history, societies understood themselves as intimately intertwined with the rhythms of the earth. They extracted resources, but they also recognized a vital, sacred limit to that extraction. Capital, however, possesses no such reverence. It perceives the natural world neither as a home nor as a living organism. To the market, the planet is merely an infinite warehouse of free raw materials waiting to be monetized. Karl Marx described a profound metabolic rift opening between humanity and the earth under this relentless system. A healthy metabolism requires balance. What is taken from the soil must eventually be returned to it. But capitalist agriculture and industry rupture this cycle violently. They extract nutrients from the land to produce commodities in the cities, creating exhausted soil in one place and mountains of toxic waste in another. This rupture is driven by the most fundamental law of the system we have discussed so far. Capital must grow continually simply to survive. A corporation cannot decide that it has reached a sufficient level of wealth and suddenly stop expanding. It must relentlessly seek greater profits each quarter. But this iron law of infinite financial expansion is fundamentally incompatible with the strict physical limits of a finite planet. Today, we are told that technology will effortlessly resolve this devastating contradiction. We are encouraged to buy electric vehicles, purchase ethically sourced coffee, and recycle our plastic containers with religious devotion. This phenomenon is often referred to as green capitalism. It sells us the comforting illusion that we can simply consume our way out of ecological collapse by purchasing a slightly different, more expensive set of mass-produced commodities. But replacing internal combustion engines with massive lithium batteries does not challenge the underlying sickness of society. It merely shifts the zone of extraction from oil wells to devastated mining regions in the global south. The core requirement remains unchanged. The system still demands the infinite extraction of minerals, the infinite production of vehicles, and the infinite expansion of markets. The machine just learns to paint itself green. When global temperatures rise and extreme weather events devastate entire communities, mainstream economists mildly refer to this catastrophe as a market externality. They treat the death of ecosystems as a minor glitch in their abstract accounting ledgers. But the climate crisis is not a mistake. It is the absolute, predictable result of an economic logic that must treat the biosphere as a disposable toilet for industrial exhaust. Crucially, the agony of this ecological rupture is distributed with terrifying injustice. The billionaire class who orchestrated the devastation can easily purchase refuge in fortified mansions high above the rising tides. Meanwhile, the most precarious populations, the discarded reserve army of labor living in marginalized zones, bear the absolute brunt of the floods, the famines, and the unrelenting heat. Capital privatizes the wealth while fully socializing the disaster. This dynamic creates a profound generational melancholy, a deep ecological anxiety that haunts the youth of the 21st century. They look toward the future not with anticipation, but with deep dread. They are expected to study hard, take on massive debt, and enter the labor market, all while understanding, subconsciously, that the very ground beneath their feet is biologically collapsing under the weight of corporate ambition. Resolving this terminal crisis requires a complete revolution in how we value life itself. We cannot save the planet simply by adjusting tax rates or subsidizing solar panels while leaving the fundamental logic of infinite accumulation intact. We must rip the control of production away from the blind imperative of profit and consciously realign our economy with the delicate, unforgiving rhythms of the natural biosphere. We cannot heal the wounded earth until we destroy the engine that demands her blood. Chapter 16. The State, the Law, and the Illusion of Neutrality. We are raised to believe that the state exists as a perfectly neutral umpire residing above the chaos of the marketplace. the law is presented as a blindfolded goddess, dispensing justice equally to both the billionaire and the beggar. We imagine that our democratic institutions belong to the citizens, operating exclusively to protect our shared human rights and to regulate the worst excesses of unbridled corporate greed. But when we examine the actual historical function of the state through a materialist lens, a completely different reality emerges. The modern governing apparatus is not a neutral mediator hovering neutrally above class conflict. It functions primarily as an executive committee designed to manage the common affairs of the capitalist class. It guarantees the fundamental rules of the game that allow continuous wealth accumulation to proceed uninterrupted. The absolute foundation of this legal architecture is the sacred defense of private property. The law strictly protects the right of a corporation to own massive infrastructure or a sprawling digital platform. Yet, it offers no equivalent absolute protection for the exhausted worker seeking guaranteed shelter or reliable sustenance. The scales of justice are structurally weighted heavily before the trial even begins. This inherent bias becomes blindingly obvious during times of extreme economic crisis, when global financial networks implode due to relentless speculative greed. The state immediately discards its alleged neutrality. It deploys trillions in public funds to rescue failing banks and monopolies, citing the absolute necessity of saving the economy. Private risk is instantly socialized, subsidized by the very taxpayers who just lost their homes and livelihoods. Conversely, when the working masses face extreme destitution, the state preaches the virtues of austerity and individual responsibility. There are no trillion-dollar bailouts for the precarious delivery rider or the drowning professional trapped in medical debt. The government suddenly remembers the strict boundaries of the free market, insisting that any direct intervention to alleviate ordinary human suffering would inevitably distort the natural efficiency of the economy. We must also reevaluate the true purpose of the disciplinary forces employed by the state. The police and the prisons do not merely exist to protect ordinary citizens from random violence. Their deepest structural function is to guard the boundaries of concentrated wealth. They secure the empty mansions, while the homeless freeze outside, enforcing the property relations that produce artificial scarcity amidst unprecedented material abundance. This reality completely transforms how we understand modern political elections. We are offered a choice between competing factions that often differ only on cultural rhetoric or minor regulatory adjustments. But the core engine of the economy remains completely off-limits to democratic debate. No major political party dares to challenge the fundamental dictatorship of capital, ensuring that the extraction of surplus value continues regardless of who holds office. The system maintains this illusion of democratic control because a naked dictatorship of wealth would invite immediate rebellion. By allowing citizens to vote on peripheral issues, the state successfully vents public frustration in completely harmless directions. We expend our political energy battling over superficial differences, while the deep architecture of financial power operates in total silence, completely insulated from the angry screams of the voting populace. You cannot litigate your way out of a structural contradiction. The courts are designed to resolve disputes within the capitalist framework, not to dismantle the framework itself. If a manager legally fires thousands of workers to boost stock prices, the law applauds the fiduciary responsibility. But if those workers confiscate the factory to feed their families, the full violent force of the law descends upon them instantly. Ultimately, the modern state stands above society as an alienating force, much like capital itself. We relinquish our autonomy to a leviathan that inexplicably uses our own resources to discipline us. The administrative bureaucracies manage the symptoms of extreme inequality, deploying just enough welfare to prevent riots, but never enough to actually liberate the citizen from the desperate need to sell their labor power. To achieve genuine emancipation, we must abandon the naive hope that the state will eventually save us from capital. The government apparatus and the economic system are twin pillars supporting the exact same architecture of domination. We cannot merely inherit the existing state machinery and wield it for different purposes. We must fundamentally reimagine how human beings govern themselves without relying on coercion and manufactured scarcity. The gavel only strikes to protect the crown it serves. Chapter 17: The Reclamation of Time and the True Abundance of Human Life. When we survey this immense social architecture, we must recognize that the ultimate struggle of capital is not over money or physical space. It is over our most precious and non-renewable resource, time. Life, at its very essence, is composed of the continuous flow of time. Whoever controls your time truly controls your life. In modern society, this control has become invisibly pervasive. In the early industrial era, the theft of time was blatantly obvious. Workers entered massive, noisy factories at the command of a whistle, selling their hours under the relentless gaze of the clock. Back then, exploitation had clear physical boundaries. When the workers exhaustedly left the factory gates, they at least formally reclaimed control over their remaining hours within their modest dwellings. However, today this sacred boundary has been completely erased. Through glowing screens and always-on mobile networks, the defensive line between working time and resting time has collapsed. We are told this is a freedom that allows for flexible work. In reality, it allows the tentacles of capital to reach into every private crevice of our lives, transforming work into a haunting, permanent state. Late-night emails, urgent weekend notifications, and active work groups form invisible shackles, from which modern individuals cannot escape. We are always on standby, transforming our bedrooms into extensions of the digital factory. Even during sleep, our subconscious remains in a tense state of readiness. Capital has successfully colonized our dreams, downgrading biological rest into mere machine maintenance for tomorrow's labor. Even more suffocating than the expansion of working hours is the brutal harvesting of our attention. Even during leisure time unoccupied by employers, we have not attained true freedom. Social media algorithms, designed through complex calculations, act like efficient pumps, siphoning away our remaining mental energy. We mindlessly scroll before glowing screens, surrendering our souls to the infinite information stream. We generously convert time that could have been used for deep reflection, quiet reading, or authentic relationships into advertising revenue for tech giants. Capital keenly perceives that intense work pursuit is a profound spiritual vacuum, which it immediately fills with cheap digital entertainment. We function simultaneously as exhausted producers and blind consumers, trapped within a perfectly closed loop of total depletion. This dual colonization of time and attention results in a universal state of chronic fatigue and existential crisis. We live in an era of unprecedented material wealth, yet we often feel that our lives are utterly shallow and dry. Although we possess more accessible commodities, we have completely lost the internal agency to savor existence. everything is accelerated, and consequently, everything is rapidly devalued. When every crevice of life is filled with utilitarian tasks and fragmented information pushed by algorithms, the creative and poetic essence of human existence dissolves. Marx profoundly noted that true human emancipation is not merely about escaping extreme poverty, it is about achieving the absolute abundance of free time. Real social wealth is not a mountain of dead commodities, but time that people can dispose of freely. Only within these pure hours, unburdened by any economic purpose, can a human being develop their suppressed potential. In free time, one can appreciate art, explore science, and deeply understand the world, finally becoming a whole and autonomous individual. Therefore, the fundamental evil of capitalism lies not only in unjust distribution, but in its ruthless denial of the possibility for total human development. Within this sprawling machine of constant acceleration, maintaining a slow and deep rhythm of life is in itself a magnificent act of rebellion. We must bravely reclaim those seemingly useless hours to stare at the stars, to walk aimlessly, and to accompany our loved ones. We must engage in pure practices that offer no economic return to resist the savage logic of total commercialization. The time that belongs truly to the human being is the only real wealth in this world. Chapter 18. The Epilogue, Life After the Screen and the Quiet Resistance. When this long narration finally draws to a close, when the light of the screen gradually dims before your eyes, you will have to face that familiar and cold real world again. The sun will still rise tomorrow as usual. The crowded subway will still roar in on time, and that desk filled with deadlines is still quietly waiting for you. Understanding the huge machine of capital will not instantly create a utopia for you. You might feel an unprecedented heaviness when you finally see the huge structures hidden behind daily chores. When you understand how every drop of your sweat is accurately calculated and converted into wealth for others. A deep sense of powerlessness might briefly drown you. Since this machine is so precise and so huge, since it is already deeply rooted in our blood and breath, the individual awakening within such a colossal apparatus may initially feel minute. But this clarity is precisely your only weapon to preserve your self-dignity within this machine. Before this, you painfully blamed every setback and exhaustion in your work on your own lack of effort and mediocre talent. You were taught to reflect on your efficiency late at night and to whip yourself to keep running in anxiety. And now you finally understand that it was definitely not your fault. It was just the system, accurately harvesting your remaining life. With this insight, the way you see the world will change irreversibly. When you see those food delivery riders shuttling between high-rise buildings again, what you see is no longer the convenient service the system is proud of, but your fellow humans ruthlessly squeezed by algorithms. When you face those flashy consumerist advertisements, you no longer feel self-pity and blind desire, but clearly see through the hypocritical commodity fetishism logic behind it. True rebellion is not always accompanied by the noise of the street and grand slogans. Under the strict rule of modern capital, the deepest resistance often occurs in the silent depths of your heart. It happens at the moment when you refuse to equate your entire life value with the balance of your bank card. It happens at the moment when you decide to divide the energy originally used for infinite internal competition to a book, a cloud, or a real hug. Capital tries to tear us apart into isolated islands, letting us guard against and hate each other in endless competition. It tells us that everyone is the chief executive officer of their own destiny and has nothing but interests. But you now thoroughly understand the sinister intention of this discourse. Therefore, you begin to look for those real connections again, to establish those pure relationships that are not for the purpose of transaction. In the cold iron cage, we can still warm each other. The script of history has never been finished. The system tries to make us believe that it is the final form of human society, an insurmountable natural law. But in this long river of time, no exploitation system can truly achieve eternity. Deep contradictions are constantly accumulating, and fatal cracks are quietly spreading at the bottom of the building. We may be at the end of a long night, and every awakening of yours is accumulating a glimmer of light for the coming dawn. Do not feel hopeless because your personal power is small. Do not choose to close your eyes again and retreat back to that false comfort of boiling frogs because the road is long. Live with this clear pain, breathe love, and bravely create those real riches that can absolutely not be clearly priced. In this world that tries to thoroughly commodify everything, please try your best to maintain your integrity and purity as a real person. Walking into the night with your eyes open is in itself a trek toward the light.